welcome to the Theology Mill, brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. I'm your host, Zach Mickle. In this podcast, we interview some of the leading authors in theology, biblical studies, philosophy, and more. Many of the folks we talk with on the show are also authors with us at Whitfinstock, where we have the honor of putting into print a broad swath of work that nourishes both the academy and the church. On this episode, I interviewed Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood. Dr. Wood recently published a really exciting book with the University of Notre Dame Press, which is called The Whole Mystery of Christ, Creation as Incarnation in Maximus the Confessor. He received his PhD in theology from Boston College and is a stay-at-home father of 4 girls, which is quite a feat, I have to say. In this interview for our podcast series, The Grind, Dr. Wood and I discuss his intellectual formation, his experiences as a PhD student and young scholar, how he's carved his own way as an academic, and a whole lot more. So without further ado, friends, let's head over to the interview. So I'm here with Dr. Jordan Daniel Wood, whose book just dropped, two weeks ago?
Yeah, pretty much 2 weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah. So The Whole Mystery of Christ is what it's called, right? Creation as Incarnation in Maximus Confessor. So that's with Notre Dame Press, which, by the way, I don't know how closely you got to work with the people there, but they are wonderful. I've gotten the chance to interact with them a bit, and they're just good people, but also their publishing list is really fantastic too. So
yeah, no, they were great to work with. Very easy, very firing on all cylinders all the time. So
yes, yeah, for sure, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about what we're drinking. So I am drinking a matcha tea right here, which is my new morning go-to. I've actually only been drinking matcha for the past couple of months. Some of my friends kind of converted me from coffee to tea and then to matcha, which has been kind of a life changer. But so this is what I'm drinking here, Naoki matcha. Of course, it's ceremonial grade. It's from grown in Uji, Kyoto. It's the only matcha I've ever had, honestly, but it's so good. It's delicious. So I'm drinking it in a latte form with raw milk, which I hope is not too controversial for people, but I find it to be delicious and it doesn't upset my stomach. So,
wow.
Yeah, but anyways, it's delicious. What are you sipping on?
Well, I've just got a brick and mortar light roast coffee here. I don't really know. The thing is, so what I do, because I have to work in the wee hours of the morning.
Yeah.
I have a very cheap coffee maker, probably a $15 one, and I grind the beans the night before. I set everything up to where I just have to push a button when I wake up. I just want to push one button. So sometimes I forget which beans I have ground. But I think this one's just the grocery store it's called brick and mortar.
Okay.
Ethiopia light roast.
Nice.
So that's what I got.
Ethiopian's my favorite. Nice.
It's so good, yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell which roast you're drinking by the flavor if you're not sure what you put in?
Yes, I can, and it's funny. I didn't drink coffee or really anything like that until I was 27.
Okay.
Which was the very week that my first daughter was born.
Okay.
So I was like, well, since I'm a dad, I may as well just jump ahead, I was and then I was like, well, if I'm going to do this, I hate coffee. My mom loved it. My dad to this day doesn't drink it. But I was like, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm not going to do all the sugar and everything. I just want to go straight black. I don't like it anyway. May as well. So I always just straight black. That's what I love. And so so that means I began I'm not going to be one of those coffee snobs, and then of course here I am, 8 years later. Yeah, I was just thinking yesterday, this tastes a little different in this mug as opposed to this other one. I was like, what have I become?
That's so funny. I feel like I don't know that I've met anybody who started with black coffee. It's usually always you start with mochas and lattes, and then because black coffee doesn't taste good when you're first starting. How long did it take you before you were like, this is actually an enjoyable cup?
I would say a few months. After a few months, I was like, I don't know. I'm sure there's some kind of, you know, psychological revelation in this about me, where it's like I just went from 0 to 100 and was just like, give me the worst thing. I will force myself. I will conform to it. You know. So anyway.
Sure. Nice. Very cool. Okay. Well, let's dive into some material here. You are a student of historical theology, right? So that's what you did your PhD in at Boston College under Boyd Taylor Coolman. So why historical theology? What interested you there?
So historical theology is this strange hybrid of, as it says, history and like you might think church history or history of Christianity, and then theology in the sense of systematic or constructive, contemporary theology. And what that often means is we're sort of vulnerable in two directions, you know, because it's like the historians are like, what are you doing? And then the theologians are like, why are you doing all this history? And so you know, it's an inherent risk in the enterprise. But I chose historical theology. I mean, for me, really the way I approach all of theology, it's been, and I think a lot of people do, but it's highly autobiographical. So like I grew up in a tradition that didn't know much of anything about or didn't talk about or teach or really care a whole lot about, say, the greater Christian tradition throughout the ages. Yeah. And particularly, of course, so the Bible was the center. It's like everything. You spend all your time there. You learn the languages and so forth. But I sort of I caught wind that maybe Christians hadn't always read Scripture the way I was being led to read it, and that sort of, and particularly, I heard this name Origen of Alexandria, you know, from the 2nd, 3rd century, and how he did these wild allegorical readings and these weird figurative spiritual readings of like Noah's Ark and everything under the sun, and actually, instead of turning me off to that, I was actually very intrigued by that. So that was my entree into church history. So my point is that I had questions about what the Bible really is and what it means to call it inspired, and how then we're supposed to approach it and interpret it. What is the right way to handle it, etc. I was already motivated by these theological existential questions, but that sent me to history. That sent me to well, how have other Christians, have they asked these questions? Turns out most of the time the questions I asked weren't so unique or original. They've been there forever. And then, of course, there were, you know, there's quite a rich discussion around it that stretches across the ages and different continents and languages and so forth. So that was like already autobiographically, that was my my interest in history. It wasn't simply antiquarian. It wasn't just like, oh, I want to be a scholar of the 7th century or something like that. It was what did these people say about God and Christ and Scripture and reading it, and then, you know, and then all these other questions that arise. So historical theology, for me, what it functionally meant, because actually when I was admitted to the PhD program, they right up front said, we're not really sure whether to place you in historical theology or in systematics.
Okay.
And I was kind of like, well, that's good, because I don't know either, you know. But it was, what I thought was this. I sort of made an analogy to artists or like a painter. And if you're going to, I have some friends that are painters, and it's like, you know, one of the things that they did in their formation was to imitate the masters, right? To recreate, you know, Da Vinci's this or that, or Caravaggio or whatever. And it's not like you're doing it, and just as if you're a musician or a sports player or whatever, you're doing it in order to make the technique inherent. And you're sort of, you know, it's Aristotelian. It's like you practice through habit, it becomes second nature. And then only then, when you've sort of mastered the techniques by imitating a grand master, then you start to add your own flares, your own personal style, as it were, and you start to really then legitimately become a creator yourself. And so I felt like it was, and it's not to denigrate anyone out there. I know some great people that are PhD in systematics, and they're doing fine. But for me personally, I was like, it was sort of daunting to be like, hey, you're going to write a dissertation that's an actual contribution to like systematic Christian theology, even though it's the first thing you've ever really done. And I was kind of like, that feels like backwards to me. For me, I wanna apprentice myself to some master or group of masters. You can only do so much, and I want to learn the techniques. I want to imitate. I want to follow. I want to immerse myself in the entire thought and theological vision of someone who is compelling and who is a master. And then maybe at some point, or maybe not, but maybe at some point I will be able to make something like my own personal style contributions to the whole tradition. And so that's to me broadly why historical theology, and it's why I personally chose that. And it is a personal choice. So
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I feel like a lot of dissertations in systematic theology are kind of historically thin, like you're talking about. And even not even just dissertations, but honestly, I feel like a lot of theologians who work in systematics, like it seems like sometimes that there's not always a strong grasp of like the tradition, and even if they're consulting the tradition, it just seems like a rather like thin retrieval versus thick retrieval, which is kind of more what you're up to.
yeah, and it's to me there's sort of two categories of some of the people I've met, and of course I won't name names because I want to be amicable, but there are some people on sort of one extreme end of the spectrum who basically write up their entire dissertation proposal, and I mean they would come back after meeting with their advisor and say, oh man, now I got to make this theological somehow. And I'm kind of like, well, this is a theology department. Like, you could have done this thing anywhere else. But
Right.
so it really did feel like an extrinsic or an additional sort of component that they had to do to sort of dress it up, and it's sort of beside the point of the substance of what they really wanted to do. That was one sort of thing I saw happen pretty often, and I was like, I don't want to do that. Like, that's not why I'm here. But the other thing is like, it was sort of a joke that in some departments, and I can't speak for all by any means, but if you're a systematic theologian, it basically meant you did end up doing historical theology. It's just that your person was like of the last 100 years rather than way back. And so it's like you write a dissertation on Balthasar, or you write a dissertation on Lonergan or Barth or whoever, Jungel, and it's like somehow you're a systematic theologian just because you wrote on someone who died more recently. It's like, but methodologically and functionally, you're doing the same thing. So anyway, but
totally, yeah. So would you say your master is Maximus then?
Yeah, and it wasn't what I intended. I know we have a question about that later, but he became that, and I can't see myself ever shaking him entirely. He's always going to be that guide for me.
Sure. So like, why Maximus? You said you hadn't originally planned on that, so what kind of sparked that interest?
Well, to be honest, it was extremely mundane, trivial. It was very practical. I arrived at Boston College. Initially it was that, but quickly it became something else. I arrived at Boston College sort of with the intention, I wanted to do Greek patristics. I thought I was going to write a dissertation, probably on St. Gregory of Nyssa. He was someone who really captivated me by then, and I still consider him among the masters for me. But I was going to do this, under Father Khalid Anatolios, who was at BC for a long time, but I didn't know that exactly when I was coming in, he was leaving for Notre Dame. So when I arrived at BC, there was a hole for a while. They hadn't even gotten Father Brian Dunkel, who's really good, who's there now, but they hadn't gotten him yet either. So really, my first semester, I was just like looking around, like, well, hold on a second, I'm majoring in Greek patristics. I got like, what am I going to do? So they're a part of a consortium, and like you can take classes at other institutions up there. Okay. So I went to Holy Cross Hellenic, and because Father Maximus Nicholas Constus, who's sort of the great translator of Maximus into English of, say, the past decade. He had just come out with his Ambigua translation, Maximus's Ambigua, in 2 volumes with Dunbarton Oaks, and basically was just teaching a class on it. And I was like, that's cool. Like, I've read Maximus. I've read that little popular patristics volume, that blue one, Cosmic Mystery of Christ. Yeah. And he was really interesting, so let's take this class. And I even showed up the first day not knowing if I was going to be able to stay there because I had missed registration and all this stuff. So anyway, I just show up to his class. I'm like, hey, I would love to, be in your class, even though I'm not part of your institution and stuff. Yeah. And he graciously allowed me to stay. And honestly, within about 2-3 weeks of reading, all we did was read Maximus. We didn't read like anything else. I was hooked. I was kind of like, okay, this is far more than I expected and far more fascinating. So that's kind of how it
Yeah.
happened. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to talk a little more about like your theological formation. I know you had mentioned earlier how you grew up in a different tradition, and I'm
Hmm.
looking at your CV right now. I see you did your undergrad at Ozark Christian College,
Yeah.
and then you moved to St. Louis University for your master's, SLU as they call it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you did some study in France, and then your PhD in historical theology at Boston College, like you said. So if you could like quickly kind of sum up your trajectory through all those stages, how would you describe kind of your theological formation?
Yeah. Yeah, and we've already touched on it, so this will be able to facilitate it. Yeah, I went to Ozark Christian College. It's in this movement called the Stone Campbell movement, the Restoration movement. There's different ways to call it, but it's basically Christian churches, Disciples of Christ, Church of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
All of them are from that, and it's there's I don't want to all my family is still in that tradition. So there's a lot that I appreciate about it. Among which was when I was an 18-year-old going to Bible college at 7 o'clock every morning for 4 days a week, I was taking Greek. And I
Wow.
took Greek. Yeah, and actually the Ozark where I was, it was kind of this amazing moment where there was so much possibility to especially develop linguistic skills. So I took like
Mm-hmm.
3 years of Greek. I took 2 years of Hebrew. I took a semester of Aramaic. I sat in
That's
on
awesome.
Ugaritic, and there's Akkadian, and I did started German and Latin there and all this stuff. So
Wow.
it's kind of like catching up from I was a public school guy, so we didn't do much but read I don't know, Shakespeare 1,000 times.
Yeah.
So so I was read Ray Bradbury or something.
Yeah.
So I was so that was I appreciated all that, but as I said before, over the course of my time there, it was just very thin on what I would call philosophical theology or systematic theology. Now I didn't know that was the name then, but it was honestly it was sort of funny because I felt like I recapitulated in my own self, to be a little audacious here, kind of like the actual unfolding of Christian thought over its own tradition, insofar
Mm-hmm.
as for me the Scripture was central and you're studying it in depth, and naturally questions arise, and you say, "Well, hold on
Right.
a second. There's these 5 times in the Old Testament where God seems to command the genocide of all these people. Is that
Yeah.
just did that? Is like does God do that? I mean, and so you start raising questions, especially in light of the Incarnation and the light of Christ, and here we have Christ who, while we were yet sinners and hostile to God, he died for us
Mm-hmm.
who's sort of self-giving to the most infinite degree imaginable, really not imaginable, and yet also is the same God, consubstantial with the Father and the Spirit, who in the Old Testament seems to, on the surface, command genocide, and so
Mm-hmm.
these are obvious. These are, to me at least, obvious tensions at best. We'll say
Mm-hmm.
tensions. So that tension creates questions, and so really the questions arose out of studying Scripture in that certain context. So
Yeah.
that's why I was like, how did other people read this? I had heard about Origin in a negative light, so I went to SLU then, the next step, because there was an Origin scholar there. He's still there, named Dr. Peter
Okay.
Martins. I studied with him, and I wrote a thesis on Origin there that became my first article, and it really was my question. I went there and I said, I just want to know why Origin thought he could get away with reading Scripture this way. And I want an answer better than like, well, he was Greek and all this influence of
Yeah.
Plato, and like, no, well, like,
Sure.
okay, there's some of that, but did he have actual Christian theological reasons
Right.
to justify the way he handled, say, the conquest narratives of Joshua in his homilies, which he preached over them?
Right.
And wherein he says, "I do not think that the apostles would have handed down this text to be as scripture unless they wanted us to read it allegorically or figuratively. For it is written that Christ is, the Prince of Peace." So,
Yeah.
so like that was so much what I did there, and that kind of opened the entire greater tradition to me. So the question was about Scripture, how to interpret it. I went to Origen and the Alexandrian tradition. And that opened up all the other stuff, Christology, the development of Christology, Trinitarian stuff in the patristic era broadly, and into the medieval era as well. So that's what when I went to France, that was just because I wanted to acquire a language, an actual living. I had studied all these dead languages.
Okay.
I wanted to be able to at least speak to some, useful extent, some living language. And so
Sure.
my wife was already really good at Spanish. I didn't have a lot of interest in acquiring that because I had a bad experience in high school with Spanish.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do German because I thought, well, that's what you do if you're in theology or whatever.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't want to do German. I have no interest in that. And so we compromised in French. But so we went there, and then when I went to do the Boston College thing, it was sort of I wanted to continue. I wanted to extend what I had begun at SLU. And I wanted to study. As I said, I thought I was going to stay in the Alexandrian Greek tradition, more 4th century, but I ended up coming to see that Maximus really was, in my opinion, the culmination of that. So I focused there.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's so interesting. What was your experience like as a PhD student? Because I know, right, Boston College, that's a pretty rigorous program. You're learning languages. You're studying historical theology. How did you enjoy being a PhD student? What was that experience like for you?
Well, I have to say, what made it what it was, and I hear this quite a bit actually, was the camaraderie, right? Was the cohort. I mean, I came in with the only 2 people that came in the historical program that year was me and a guy named now Dr. Justin Sean Coyle, who's at Mount Angel, actually close to where you are, right? Out there.
Yeah.
And so Justin and I, but we also were poor and couldn't afford to live in Boston, and we were having like our families were growing and stuff. So we actually lived in Providence, Rhode Island.
Okay.
And so we would commute together up to Boston College, just he and I most of the time, with some other people sometimes. So that was like we lived on the same street. Our kids started to play. So I think that was like foremost for me. And my advisor was really good. He actually lived a few blocks over as well, and his family. And there really was this kind of like community of attentive to the, not just like you as an academic or as a budding scholar, but as a whole person. How are your kids doing? We all sort of know each other. We help each other out. So that was like. That is a unique thing. I don't, that's not necessarily inherent in every program or anything, but that was hugely formative for me. And so much of what, I was thinking and how I was thinking was sort of, set through or pushed through many conversations with many different of those, those people. So that was a huge part of it. Boston College itself was great because of the resources they have are incredible. It's not. I mean, Boston College is especially unique because it acquired a seminary, which is right across the street from it, years ago. And so, really, functionally, what it means is they have a school of theology and ministry, which is what they acquired, and then they have a department of theology on campus at Boston College. So you effectively have 2 faculties of theology, like 2 big ones, two large ones. And so you've got like, I don't know, 40, 50 full-time scholars there all across and in different areas and specialties. So you got all kinds, but not only that, if you're at a place like Boston College, and there's other places where this is true too, I really made a point to take some courses like in other departments, especially philosophy. So I got to take, for example, 2 courses on Plotinus and Neoplatonism with the great Plotinus scholar, Dr. Gary Gertler, who's a Jesuit. And so there was just a lot of resources there, and that doesn't even include the consortium. And you could go take courses at Harvard or whatever. But so my experience there was really good, mostly due to the camaraderie and kind of my advisor's attentiveness to the whole person of the student rather than just what they produce. And then, obviously, just sort of the resources available. It's just really hard to have to recreate that anywhere else. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, and I think I hear it's pretty common to have kids, right? And to have a spouse and kids during a PhD program, but I don't know. I can only imagine what that would be like. It sounds like it would be pretty challenging. So, what was that like for you, being in a PhD program? Trying to care for your wife, your growing family, and then even beyond that, like as a young scholar after you finished your PhD, what has that been like, sort of balancing family life with scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, it's a perennial issue. I mean, probably what I'm
Yeah.
about to say, some people will laugh out loud, perhaps, because it's just so, here's the thing about like this kind of work. It's hard to explain because for most people, it's a hobby to read,
Right.
write, and to maybe to write a little. And so there are, people in my extended family and stuff like that. Sometimes I have a difficult time explaining like, or like this question, right? And my wife, she's awesome. She's a nurse. She's like,
Mm-hmm.
great, really great success in her career, and she's just a wonderful person. And she, would come home. Or like one year, I had my dissertation year where I'm just like going into the office and writing every day. And she, you come home, and of course the question was like, oh, how much did you get done today? And I'm like, I don't know. It's like you can't like it's so, at least for me personally, the process of writing, it's so far from very clear, regimented, quantifiable. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, you can say things like some days I'm like, wow, I wrote 5,000 words today, but then other days it's like, well, I spent 8 hours on a single footnote and like got, 2 sentences down, and so,
Yeah.
and then other times, you're staring at a blank screen, like all that stuff, all the
Yeah.
kind of cliches, but they're kind of true, is valid. But then also, I think too, in theology in particular, it's very hard because basically people just, if they don't know much about the discipline or like what you're doing, they just think,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so like you just read the Bible and like talk about it, or what? Like, what's the, because it's everyone's trying to grasp for like analogs in their own experience.
Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
maybe they've gone to Sunday school, maybe they've been a part of a book discussion one time or a book group, and they're just trying to like understand what it means to work all this time you're spending, and right, and all this, and you can.
Yeah.
So all that to say, when it comes to like balancing the time and to say, well, I can't really go to this event or something like that. Sometimes it's hard to navigate those situations. But that said, I mean, I've been fortunate. My wife is extremely understanding and empathetic, and she has really been supportive. In fact, I would say there were several moments where I was the one that was kind of like, why am I doing this? Like, what's the point of
Yeah.
this? Like, we make hardly any money. We're so far away from family. We're trying to grow a family, like literally
Yeah.
across the country from all of our actual family that could help. We don't have money to pay for babysitters. We don't pay for daycare. So
Yeah.
one of us is always with the kids.
Yeah.
What? And so, and she was the one that'd be like, this is inherently like, because I'm like, what's the point of this? Like, no one cares about what I think about this stuff. And she would be the one that would, protest against my my sort of sappy, why woe is me thing, and be
Yeah.
like, no, this is important. Like, we're here to do this. We're all committed. And so,
Yeah.
there's a lot of times where PhD students, marriages fall apart,
Mm-hmm.
families, bad habits get started, so that there's distance between, the kids and stuff. And I couldn't stress more, like, it's an entire commitment of the whole family. It's not just you,
Yeah.
being real smart and studious and reading a bunch and writing a bunch. It's like it creates weird demands that are hard to communicate to anyone that hasn't experienced it or hasn't been close to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so everyone has to kind of be on board about what it is we're doing and how we're going to have to do it. And I was very fortunate to have that with my family. And even now, so now I'm a stay-at-home dad. After I got my PhD, I did teach 2 years as a VAP, a visiting professor at Providence College, which was very close to me, and I loved it. I got to teach in their kind of great books program as well as theology. And then I did do, let's see, and then this was the middle of the pandemic. We were kind of at that point, VAPs are limited. I knew there's a time limit to this. It's not going to go on forever, at least in the way they had it set up there. And so I had this offer to take a high school job, actually at my wife's alma mater back here close to family.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay.
So I took this theology teaching job, teaching at an all-girls Catholic school. I've got 4 girls. It's like, well, whatever.
Okay.
I just got it's just girls everywhere. So, so it's like it's all I know now. Even though I grew up as one of 3 boys, now all I know is girls. So I was teaching mainly juniors and seniors, like theology and philosophy, and some of it for college credit, but mostly just for their high school thing. And I took that job for 1 year to kind of get us here. It was the middle of the pandemic. It was just like, you know what, we're basically intending to have a fourth kid, so I don't know. And so it kind of locked into place. A few things did, and so we moved back here. I taught high school for 1 year. I also adjuncted a little bit since then, and so but here I am now, and now for a full year, I think it's been I've been a stay-at-home dad. And so I've got 4 daughters, and I do the stay-at-home dad thing. And my wife, being a nurse, she's full-time, but she and this is a huge perk. She works 3 long days a week, 12-hour shifts, which means that I get a day or two a week where I can kind of work on my own stuff, like part-time from home. And so that does create its own tensions, and you got to navigate stuff because, when things come up or there's appointments or kids are sick or whatever, usually, of course it's me who has to kind of give up my time because I don't have a boss. I don't have anybody saying, well, you need to do this or whatever. So but that's so I there are just open communication and working hard at it. I don't know that those are general remarks, but that's kind of that it gives you a sense of the sort of the give and take that it does really take to sustain this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean that was part of the reason why I wanted an interview. I know we had emailed a bit about this beforehand, but because your path, post PhD has been somewhat unorthodox, or at least what you're doing now as a stay-at-home dad is unorthodox, which I think is awesome, by the way. Like, I have so much respect for stay-at-home parents and just parenting in general.
Thank you.
And the fact that I mean I'm a father of 1 and doing that with 4, like that's awesome. But then doing that and being like a very active young academic, I think is just really impressive. But I'm curious, like, was this sort of a deliberate choice of yours? Like, why have you opted for kind of this unorthodox setup? Like, what has made you want to sort of do things that way?
Well, yeah. So this will get into the juicy parts because it's the answer is yes and no, in the sense that yes, I have opted for it, and in another way, no, I haven't. And so let's start with the no.
Okay.
I mean, look. Here's the thing: you're going through PhD. You're going through it. You're working hard. You feel like you're doing your very best. And at the same time, and I think a lot of people are going to relate to this out there. If you're in the program right now, or you just were, or you're about to read, everyone's heard all the horror stories. I just saw actually a really funny. It was funny to me at least, but it was like this. Someone remarked. I think it was some comedian was like, "Oh, you got a PhD in theology? Like, okay, so I'll take a latte with It's like and you hear these quote unquote horror stories where it's like so and so has all these publications and they've impressed all these people and blah blah blah, and they can read all these languages, but they can't find anything. And here's where it's getting a little bit, I need to be introspective, and I'm willing to be open about it because I think it's useful, and it's something that's still ongoing with me. I knew that objectively. I knew that was like the chances for me, and I don't know how far we want to go into this, but let's just say there are, given the kind of, like the academy, to no one's surprise, mirrors the polarization of society and politics and ideology, etc.
For sure.
So if you do not fall, and there's the question of merit. That's one thing. Whether or not merit does a whole lot, I tend to think it doesn't do very much. It's like a bare minimum, but it really guarantees almost nothing. But if you don't fall very clearly into certain boxes on any side, I'm not saying it's one side. In fact, I know from experience it is both sides, so to speak, that do the same thing, even though they want to pretend that they're nothing like the other side. And if you don't immediately make sense to them, that's a liability. Because, number one, there's tons of PhDs and there's not a lot of jobs. We all know that. The humanities are shrinking. We all know that. Theology, even more so in certain ways, in philosophy. We all know that. There's all these pressures, right? And then you've got the backroom politics, and you've got the nepotism, and you got so-and-so's got this student, and he was my friend, and I want to do him a favor, so let's interview this person. All that stuff goes on, whether or not people want to say it out loud, it just does. And so you almost never, even when you're on the job market, you almost never know what's going on. And it's really futile to even try to pretend or to pry and to figure out what's going on behind the scenes. You do not know. And it can be as whimsical as you can imagine. So I know all this, right? I've already heard all this while I'm in my program. And even before I got into the program. But there's this little voice inside, and it's really pride or something like that, at least for me. I'm just speaking personally now. That kind of says, yes, I know there are those anecdotes. I've heard those stories. But, all you need is one to come through. And then you got a position, or you got a job, you got a career, you got a future. At least in the traditional way, like you said, the sort of orthodox way that it's supposed to go. If you work really hard, you impress the right people, you're not a total jerk, you're personable or whatever, and you will eventually. And I heard this said to me several times from different people, and even recently, it's like it's gonna work out eventually. Like it might take longer than it used to. Like say 20 years ago, you might not have offers before you even finish your PhD.
Yeah.
Although if you're in a certain kind of category, you will. I've seen people get offers before they even finish their dissertation, and there's a million reasons for that, mostly ideological. But it's I believed that. What I came to realize later was I believed fundamentally that somehow it was going to be different. Somehow, or I believed two things at once, and it's not consistent. This is the nature of self-delusion. It's not consistent. On the one hand, I kind of almost still thought that merit was going to work. It's like an idealistic sort of thing. Even though all the evidence showed that is not the determinative factor. On the other hand, and this is kind of the deeper problem, this is when it kind of almost becomes a spiritual introspective journey, which it has been for me. I also thought, well, you know what? Even if it doesn't work out, I won't care. I won't care. Because you know what? And this is true. Some of what I'm about to say is true.
Yeah.
I've got at least these 5 years or whatever studying stuff I love. I can maybe get a book out there. And if I never do it again, I said this. If I never do it again, it was worth it. Which, again, objectively, I do believe. And so that's what you tell yourself, at least I told myself, was, and I will be fine with that. Because in a sense, this is all a gift anyway. Which is all true. Like objectively, that's all true. But what I didn't realize was how ignorant of myself that I was, because actually I did care about that. It turns out, it does turn out that I want to be recognized. That I want to be, It turns out that I do want, the kind of perks of a job. And of course, all that is the grass is greener sort of thing. It's like you imagine, oh, wow, it would be great if I had this job. Because what I told myself was, you know what? Okay, I can accept that the tenure track sort of dream job that people used to get 40, 30 years ago for just being really good at it is not a thing anymore. Like it's very rare and it's going to be vanishingly rare. But, there are a lot of liberal arts colleges, there's small colleges. I might just get a small a job at a small place and I'll have to work hard, but at least, that's still a career. That's still something, right? And you still get the academic calendar and all that. Well, it turns out that even that, obviously is super hard to get, and all of the forces that are at work that make it sort of not really always about merit are still at work there, and they've just transferred from the higher to the lower, and perhaps they were already always there. But it's like, and so when those things have not worked out, I've been I was sort of on the job market for 2-3 years, not doing as many applications as some people do, but doing a fair share and even getting to the final round on some, getting phone interviews, I went to campus a few times, and look, it could be that I'm just not a good, people don't, maybe I'm not a good person. I don't know, like I don't, or it's just not a good fit, it's usually what people end up saying, like, it's not, because you follow up and you ask for feedback, and I've done that many times, because like, look, I want to be better, I don't want to needlessly offend people or whatever, but it's usually just that. It's like, well, no, there's nothing you can do. I've actually been told, and it was actually by a fairly conservative institution, like, well, the reason why you didn't get it is because you're a man and you're young, and it's like, okay, well, I can't do anything about that. So So, and that was from a conservative side. It's not. That's why I'm saying it's not one side or the other. They all do it. Yeah. But so what I came. So I could go on and on about all these grievances and it's unfair, blah blah blah. Woe is me. But the truth, what I really had to come to see, and this is where we transitioned from the no, like I didn't opt for this way of being a young scholar, but now to yes.
Right.
And that was kind of spiritual work, if you want to put it that way. That was hard won, and still even now I have times where I sort of as it were go through cycles or backslide. I mean, I'll put it that way. But you have to come to say, look, why do I want what I want? Mm-hmm. Like all these jobs I'm applying for. And some of them are objectively not great jobs. And perhaps I would move my entire family across the country and uproot us and get us away from family again, simply for a job at which I'm mostly miserable, or I'm overworked, or I don't have all this time like I pretend, like in my mind that I would. And so it's kind of, I had to kind of unearth and disinter a lot of my motives. And it very much turns out, at least for me, that a lot of what was motivating it wasn't necessarily the objective advantages of getting to a different place and having a title like Professor so-and-so. It really was sort of much more of a self-image thing. It was like, oh, I just want to be recognized. It's odd if you say I'm an independent scholar, or I just published my book, and it's like I had to tell them, like, look, I have no affiliation, so just put on there that I'm translating Maximus' letters for CUAP, and and you have to kind of there's been a lot of times where I've been invited to podcasts, and it's like they begin and they're like, all right, so where are you at again? And it's like home. I don't know. I'm at home. I mean, I got a cool Shoji screen. Like, I don't know. Like, is it? That's at home. I'm at home. So, and those are my kids like banging on the door or whatever, and so, and so it's a little awkward and you have these weird moments, but honestly, the awkwardness only becomes a positive source of discontent if I've already indulged a kind of fantasy self-image, which says, I really need to be recognized. I need to have certain titles and accolades, or else I'm not valuable. I'm not important, and I can't be considered a true theologian. And that's all just completely wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I had to, there was two levels of deception, self-deception. One was I had to realize that, in fact, I am not some kind of wild exception, and I do care about this stuff that I pretended that I wouldn't care about when things don't work out. That's like the way I thought, oh, well, if whatever. And then B, I had to kind of work, like, face those, and I still do. I mean, there's still days where I'm kind of like, starting to think that way again. And that's a part of the struggle now, like doing this unorthodox way where I'm a stay-at-home dad. I pick up, I'm doing 2 different translation projects. I've got a book I'm trying to write, et cetera, et cetera. Still get asked to do articles and stuff like this for places. That in order to do that, you have to find that peace that transcends understanding, in the words of Paul. You have to find that contentment. But you can't do that except through yourself. Right. And that's what I had to come to see was, like that year I taught high school. I was actually just writing about this in an article the other day. That year I taught high school. Actually, I loved the students, actually. They were great students. I still talk to some of them, have relationships with them. They're like just very good kids. And there was like no problem. Like if you want to teach high school, it was like a great place to be. It was great. But it was, there's inherent limitations, like going from Maximus the Confessor's Christological metaphysics to trying to talk about these kids about, like, I don't know, the Catholic social tradition or something.
The catechism or something.
The catechism, like, who's Thomas Aquinas, or, like, what is happiness and all that. Right. And so, which was all good, and, like, it was meaningful work, and, like, kids came to me for things, and, and all that stuff. But it wasn't for me. Like, I had to kind of see, like, it wasn't for me. But I was writing about this the other day. There was this moment in particular I'll never forget, where I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's like there's this website called Kahoot. It's why would you, right? It's where you can design these games for like unit reviews and stuff, right? Okay. And it's got these goofy music. It's like this weird arcade music, and there's like bubble letters dancing across screens, like da, 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 and I'm standing there in front of this computer. And I've made this game for them to review for their test, and it's just playing over the speakers, this weird circus music, and the whole thing, like in a single instant, I got this like utter disgust and like resentment in my heart of like, this is what I worked for, huh? This. It's all come to this. Reading all those languages, going to all those conferences, delivering papers, trying to publish, blah, 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 so I can freaking run a Kahoot game, right? And I'm like, it's like the disparity between, you know, where even my lower aspirations, given the objective, you know, state of things, versus where I had descended to, the nadir, was so jarring to me in that moment, and so unsettling, that it was really a kind of a moment of despair. And so, but then that becomes eventually, and this is what I want to say lastly, and I'll stop because I've been going for a while on this, but it's you have to come to see, and it's by God's grace, and it's through prayer, I think, and it's through a lot of things. You have to come to see that despair is an opportunity. And this is like straight up philokalia, like monastic tradition. You have to come to see this as an opportunity of true and healthy detachment. If you turn it to despair, it's an absolute hopelessness. That actually is a vice of its own, and that can create a lot of problems and a lot of destructive tendencies and patterns. But when you see it, and I'm still working at this, I have not totally succeeded by any means, but when you start to see, hold on, this is actually an opportunity for me to correct my self-image, which is a deception. It's a false image of myself.
Yeah.
Then you can maybe find contentment. And when you do that, then maybe if you can find contentment in that sort of despair, through that despair, then that opens up the possibility for creative new situations and new forms of being. New forms of being a young scholar, new forms of doing theology. Where is theology going to be done in the next several decades? Is it just going to be in colleges and universities and seminaries? I don't think so. So. It's either not going to be done at all, or it's going to be. We're going to have to think through new forms and creatively. But the only way people can think through new forms and creative forms of life to do this is if they can get through that initial loss, that detachment, that despair, and let it go, and say, you know what, that maybe isn't who I truly am anyway, and perhaps it's not what I've really been called to do, in the way to fulfill that vocation. I need to be reopen myself to new ways of doing it. And for me personally, I'm not, obviously this is so unique to my situation. I'm married to a nurse, you know, she's cool with me doing this work on the side and all that. But that's where I've come, was like, you know what, if I just get a day or so a week to do what I love to do, and it satisfies me and fulfills me, and I'm with my 4 kids from morning to night, you know, all the other days, and I'm getting, you know, they're running me into the ground as they are wont to do, and I'm drinking loads of coffee every day, and I'm shortening my lifespan by like drastically. It's not that bad though. Like I can do that. That. Some days I feel like it is bad, and then other days I don't. But that kind of the bigger picture is, that's the horizon of new possibilities, and that's sort of what I'm trying to embody now.
I think that's really wise, and that's part of the reason why I was so interested to interview you, is because, I mean, as you talked about, like these institutions and getting hired by them, right? It can be so polarized and be such like a political game, and I can only imagine that, you know, someone like you, like you're a Catholic theologian, you're deeply steeped in the patristics, but you're also engaging with like people like Hegel and Bulgakov, and but you've also got this like universalist thing going on that probably scares people. But it seems like your situation is conducive to like sort of having a freedom to be the kind of theologian that you actually are. So I guess I'm curious, what if, and you kind of explored this a bit already, but what are sort of some of the benefits of, you know, your the sort of way you've made for yourself of being an academic that's sort of unorthodox? What have been the benefits of that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the benefits are what you just sort of intimated there, which is that, you know, for one thing, I don't have a tenure file that I'm trying to compile. I don't have a tenure clock that I'm on. I mean, I've got friends that are on tenure track at places in, they're stressed out because for some of them it's like they don't know what they want to do, or they don't know what they want to write on next, or they're at a loss, and yet they're under this pressure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any of that. I mean, B, I've also known, people, I did see this pretty often actually, that there's kind of this paradoxical effect at making it in the academy. I don't think it has to be this way, but it very often is. Where say you get this tenure track job at a great tier 1 institution, and they hired you for your expertise, and all you teach is your expertise, and you've got grad students, and you've got seminars, and there's collaboration, and it's wonderful. It's like the great sort of ivory tower dream or whatever. Mm-hmm. What's interesting though is how, if you're not careful, almost you have to intentionally resist this. As a thinker, you become myopic.
Yeah.
And you become so narrow, and because your job, like your situation doesn't force you to do anything other than what you do. Like you just get your head down, you just do what you do. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. And some people just want to do that. That's fine. Mm-hmm. But I have never been one. I mean, as I said right from the beginning, when I first got into historical theology, they were like, "We're not sure if you're historical theology or want to do systematics." And I'm kind of like, "Well, I don't know either," because for me, I don't think along disciplinary lines that way. I mean, I recognize the value of disciplines and methodology, but for me, it's the questions that they're like kind of the existential question. Like this is something maybe I'll say a little broadly, and sorry if this is meandering a little, but I've never really understood doing theology for any other reason except to hang on to my faith. Like Anselm says, faith seeking understanding. And the understanding, if it's true and it's beautiful and compelling, should then reinforce the faith. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not like faith is a stage, or like it's simply the portal into which you go, and then you sort of go into that space and do thinking, and it's basically unrelated to the portal you stepped through. Mm-hmm. It is, for me at least, it's very much a sort of self-enclosed circle where I understand I have to have faith to believe, or to understand, but then the more I understand, the more that I fortify my faith. Mm-hmm. Which then the negative way to put that is, I'm trying to remain faithful, and I'm trying to hang on to belief, that is the deep sense of trust that faith really is, mm-hmm. precisely by pursuing the Lord our God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Yeah.
And so disciplinary boundaries don't necessarily conform so easily to that kind of endeavor. And so a benefit of the situation I'm in is that nobody is telling me you have to teach this class, you have to talk about this thing, you got to teach this era, you have to write this, only on your guy. I mean, I've seen a guy not get tenure, and basically his career almost tank completely because half of his publications weren't on the exact figure he was hired for.
Wow. Okay.
Even though he had already published a book and several articles, it didn't matter. I'm sure there were other things going on there too, but that was sort of an objective thing they could point to and say, well, mm-hmm. that's the reason. So that's a crazy amount of narrowness to demand. And one thing that can often happen in these contexts is that you can't actually be a thinker and retain your post. I mean, I guess the idea would be you would get tenure, and then that would secure, you can kind of do your thinking in a more expansive, free way. But and if you can make work what I'm doing, in a certain sense, I already have the benefits of tenure without having gone through the process of. So I think that I was just I'm on a translation team. I'm translating. We actually got grant money for this. I'm actually getting paid to do this part time. I'm translating Schelling's late lectures on the philosophy of revelation, awesome. And then I'm also translating Maximus's letters for the Fathers of the Church for CUAP, and these are two completely different things in a lot of ways, different mm-hmm. languages, different eras, different figures, different topics, different disciplines, philosophy, theology. I don't know if I could do that and feel wise or prudent about it if if I was in locked into some tenure track post that wasn't going to count any of this because it was outside of your thing, right?
Yeah.
So I've got this. I think I have that freedom again, if you've got the spiritual health and the mental health in these sort of situations, that can open up to this creative space.
Sure.
And yeah, and then there is that, like you've mentioned, I have no problem talking about this. There are these kind of, there aren't the sort of pressures. Now, I've been places where it would have been fine, but like my kind of, say, affinity for universalism, even as a Catholic, which I admit is sometimes a difficult balance to strike. But some people don't even want you to try. You know, some people want you to just basically say, well, that just simply is against the church. And so, but here's the thing. To me, theology isn't catechesis. They're related, and they should hopefully have a fruitful cooperative relationship. But it's literally it's almost never been the case in the actual development of the history of Christian thought and through the church councils and everything else. Where, somebody was simply just repeating what's already been said. There had to be figures like my guy Maximus, who was a monk. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a priest. He wasn't ordained a priest. He wasn't a bishop. He wasn't a leader at all. He was a lay monk. But he was, in certain ways, he was situated then to kind of fight for the fights he did and take up the causes he did, and he ended up suffering for it. And then, yet was later vindicated 19 years after his death by the same church, most of whose leaders at the time of his death were supporting his death, or his suffering. So, it makes sense to me that some people feel like, well, we got to get the basics, we got to be clear about what the church teaches and what it doesn't teach and all that. That's fine, but unless God's depths, which according to 1 Corinthians 2:1 and 2, we have access to by the Spirit which is within us, who searches even the depths of God, right? Which is what he says. Because for you have the mind of Christ, right? Who has instructed the mind of the Lord? Well, you have the mind of Christ. So no, you haven't instructed the mind of the Lord, but in his great love and kenosis for us, he has gifted us even his self-knowledge in potency, right? In the form of faith,
right.
Which can be actualized. So it's not you and your pride and because you're intelligent. It is because he is good. That's why we can learn more and more and deeper and deeper. And because he's infinite, that doesn't come to an end. It's like Karl Rahner, one of my I sort of lately come to see as a sort of master. Karl Rahner says, if all we ever do is repeat the formulas, it only means we've never understood them. I think that's true. How could you claim it? Like, this links back to my initial foray into the tradition for the sake of asking a question about scripture and how to interpret it. Well, one of the things you see over and over again in say the Alexandrian tradition, and certainly in Maximus, is if scripture is limited in the meanings that it can yield, then it simply isn't divine, because divinity is infinite. That doesn't mean that anything goes, but it does mean that what goes isn't numbered, isn't limited. Those are different things.
Right.
And I would say, why would that be any different for a divinely inspired tradition, for a living church, for the body of Christ through the ages? If you ever came to a point where you said, well, we've got it now, it's over. We've understood it all. Certainly that's not even what Vatican II teaches, in its doctrine of ecumenism. It specifically says that that's not true, but or Dei Verbum, but so it's so anyway, all that to say, it's funny. But here's my point. That was a long way to say, a lot of people are okay with that in theory. It sounds nice to say, we got to explore the depths. Sure, we got to, we don't totally understand everything, and maybe we have to even reconceive or revisit things that we thought we completely and totally understood or comprehended. Everyone likes that in theory because it sounds, kind of true, and like, okay, I don't want to pretend we can grasp everything totally and once and for all. But when people actually do it, or attempt to do it, and to do it responsibly, I'm not talking about just making stuff up, and I'm not talking about just trying to, like that person I mentioned before, say, oh, now I got to figure out how to make this theological. I've already decided everything. I want to throw God at the end. It's not that. It's there's got to be a third way. There's got to be something. I told my students this once I had students. I used to say, basically, the so-called, progressive, or the so-called, and these are caricatures, but the so-called progressive and the so-called conservative, these are just two different ways to stop thinking. right? Because
Wow.
if you're super traditional or conservative, what you're saying is all I do is receive God's self-revelation in Christ through the church and the deposit of faith. I just simply receive it. It's passive. All the thinking's been done for me. There's nothing else to do. I receive it like literally traditio tradere as passing on, like you get a bag of books, and then you just, or maybe I should say a bag of like gold or something, and then you just pass it on to the next person, and that's tradition. And that really is just a great excuse to stop thinking, to stop contemplating the mysteries of Christ, because you don't do anything. You're just passive. And I don't actually think anyone really is, but that's like one model or one extreme that we need to avoid if we want to take seriously the injunction to contemplate the mysteries of Christ. But the other way to stop thinking is to say, I don't need to engage the tradition and all that stuff that's outdated. I'm just going to go ahead and say whatever I already think and feel. Yeah. Okay, well, great. Then you don't have to think or question yourself about much, right? Again, these are caricatures. These are sort of, I don't know if anyone really falls into these entirely, probably not. But that is just a different way to stop thinking. Yeah. The difficulty is the middle. And when people really do that and take that seriously, I have found that there's quite a few people, not everybody, some people are really invigorated by it. Again, some people I think share fundamentally my conviction that one of the main reasons to theology isn't simply to catechize other people, but actually to make your own faith vital, right? Yeah. To really hang on to it and make it alive and see it and live into it. Right. But when people actually start doing that, I do think it gets, look, from an institutional perspective, it's hard to, look, how long did it take me just to describe that? A lot of time. Well, we're in the time of sound bites, of slogans, of quick marketing ads, and so on. As an institution, you don't have time for all that. Is this person fit the box or not? Do they fit the box or not? Yeah. Right? And that's what matters very often. So I have that freedom to not have to deal with all that, the bureaucracy and the marketing and all that.
Yeah, no, this is really, really interesting. I think, like, kind of along with what you're saying, that both sides of this sort of partisan paradigm seem to be like, have opposite iterations of kind of a chronological snobbery almost, like, but they're the opposite ways of doing it. So like the traditionalists almost prize history, the past at the expense of, God's revelation in the present, whereas, the progressives do the opposite of that. But this third way you're talking about, right, it kind of sounds a lot like the sort of the ressourcement school. And I think like what you and Justin Coyle are doing in some ways, like a continuation of that, but also a fresh iteration, like you're talking about, of like you guys are still going back to the patristics, to the scholastics, but you're doing so in a fresh way, and even I think moving the ressourcement movement further along. Like it's a constructive offering, I think. That's my very humble assessment. But
well, that's high praise. So I think
yeah. I'm partial to the ressourcement guys, so I guess that makes me partial to you guys as well. Last question, and then we can wrap up. I know both you and I probably should go attend to our children and drink some more coffee.
I'm sure they're okay out there on the street.
Yeah, they're probably fine. It's still the sun just rose here, so
I mean, we pay taxes. There's police.
There you go. But my last question is for people who are maybe in PhD programs, or for people who are fresh out of PhD programs who are sort of trying to discern they're going to make a way academically. What advice would you give to these people who are trying to figure this out?
Yeah. So, and this is good because it'll sort of recapitulate some of what we said. I really think, look, if you can find a way, I mean, you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why do I want to do this? I do not regret anything I've done. Mm-hmm. So I would do it all over again, even knowing that I was going to land here in my downstairs half office as a stay-at-home dad. Like, I would still do it all. And so nothing I say takes away from that. I think there's such inherent value, I wouldn't trade it. So I'm going to say that up front. However, it really is necessary for someone who's going into it or just starting it to say, to really, as best as you can, however you can do it, however you found works best, to evaluate your motives, like your desires, and say, what am I really, what am I wanting out of this? And there's always it's gonna be a process, and at least for me, it took me a long time to even uncover some of those deeper motives that I had pretended weren't there. But so as much of that work you can do, like up front or as you go, the better that, because you won't experience the fallout if and when certain things don't work out the way that you, maybe even your attenuated expectations still might not go that way. Like, there's some people that, if I was speaking to certain people specifically, depending on certain factors or features about them, I might say, you have less to worry about or more to worry about or whatever. The other thing I would say, I'm going to say this just because hopefully it doesn't make anybody mad, but whatever. I'm going to say, I'm Dad, I can say what I want. That's the freedom here. I'm embodying it right now. There are exceptions to this. Okay, I'll just say this, but anybody that got a job, let's say a tenure-track job, like 10 years ago and before, probably don't listen to anything they say.
Wow, okay.
I mean, look, some of them are self-aware enough to realize, like everyone will say things like, yeah, it's a different world. Like, oh man, you guys have to face stuff. But then the same people I've heard and other people have heard, like, will say, just hang in there. Like, well, what? But like, like it worked out for you like 20 years ago or something. But like, yeah, it's very hard for them to understand. And I think I'm going to really go out on a limb here and say, sometimes I think it's because it's somewhat, it would lead to certain sort of self-reflection that's uncomfortable. If they think too deeply about the way things are now, it immediately starts to dredge up the way it has been, how it's come to be that way. Sure. And that is often over the course of their career. And of course, no individual should feel the burden of like a systematic issues or systemic issues. Of course, I don't mean that. I'm just saying that for a lot of people, I've sensed this like resistance, this like maybe even unreflective resistance to take too seriously the dire state of things now.
Yeah.
And so so my point is, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I just have found that most, not all, but most of those people that have kind of reaped the benefits and came into their career 10 years and before now, they just can't engage with complete transparency and honesty, and they don't. And then B, they just don't know what to say, and that's the part where I'm empathetic towards them, right? Like it's not all about blaming, the prior generation or something. It's also like, I get it. You're in a situation where you don't know what it's like to face what we're facing now, and you just don't have anything to say. You have no guidance, and anytime you say anything, it's just going to be general, or it's going to be trite, or it's going to be even inaccurate. I've even had experiences where it's just like, oh, that's just not helpful at all. And so, I would say better to find people that have recently gotten a job who very much know what it was like and kind of actually know immediately the luck that's involved with them even getting it, because it creates a sort of humility and an honesty, a frankness that's really useful. And those have been the people that have really helped me the most as well. So I'd say seek those people out, younger, newly minted PhDs and people who just got jobs, or people who did 5, 6, 7 years ago. So that's another thing I would say. And then the final thing would be just make sure that whatever sacrifices you're making are worth it. That sort of ties it all together, because you're talking about why am I doing this, right? The desire, and then you're trying to say, like, what are your expectations and who do you talk to about those expectations for yourself and your projected career or situations afterwards. That needs to be summed up by saying, like I said, your whole family has to be involved. If you have a significant other, or even if you're just married, you don't have kids or whatever, all that stuff, because this is a big endeavor, and it's a lot of work, and it's it's demanding, and it's if it's a good program, it is that. And it's worth doing, but it's not worth sacrificing any of those other things that make you a whole person. It is not worth that. And so I would say reflect long and hard on each of those three things.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's super, super helpful. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I think I'd love to have you on again. I think it'd be fun maybe to get you and Justin Coyle on together at some point. So
he's my boy.
Yeah. Yeah, I've chatted with him a bit on like Instagram. I actually took a class at Mount Angel.
Oh, cool.
But not with him, and so I haven't actually met him in person. But it'd be fun to chat with both you guys. So, anyways, thank you.
He's a great guy. Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I hear. So thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to The Theology Mill, brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. If you liked what you heard and would like to hear more, you can subscribe to our show, where we have lots more content coming your way. I'm your host, Zach Mickle, signing off on this episode of The Theology Mill. We hope to see you again to share a drink and talk all things theology. Until then, good friends, God bless, and we'll see you soon.